Alright, so we're going to go ahead and start our project, and this is going to be a pretty in-depth project. It's not going to do much in terms of functionality. What it'll be, it's going to be called Shareboard, and we'll basically just have a couple inputs, a title, a body, and a link, and users will be able to share different resources over the internet, just different links to different articles, and they'll put a title and a body. Alright, and they'll be able to do that. We're also going to have complete registration and login functionality. But the main focus of this is to, of course, pay attention to the object-oriented programming, the classes, and so forth. But we're going to be building basically a really simple custom MVC framework. All right, and if you don't know what MVC is, it stands for Model View Controller, and it's a really popular design pattern in PHP and other languages as well. All right, so the idea of it is that Model View Controller, the model is basically the data. That's what is going to handle the database fetching, inserting into the database, things like that. The view is what the user sees, so it's basically the interface, templates, and mostly HTML with some PHP variables. And then the controller takes care of directing traffic. All right, so if a user clicks a link or a button, it usually triggers something in the controller, and then the controller decides whether it's going to load a page or save to a database or whatever it may be. All right, and this is just a simple structure that shows you that the user is going to see the view but use the controller. Okay, so if they click a button or a link, submit a form, they're going to deal with the controller. All right, and then that'll manipulate the model. For example, if it has to fetch data from a database, and then the model will update the view so the user then sees whatever happens next. They'll see the fetched data or whatever it may be. All right, so that's what we're going to be doing, and hopefully it's not too intimidating. I wanted to do something a little difficult, just to kind of prepare you for for building your own applications. Alright, so what I want to do first is just get the structure of our files down. Alright, so I'm working in my php.dev directory, and I have nothing here yet. So we're going to first create our index file, and that's going to be the gateway to the application, really. That's where we're going to include all our files and stuff like that. Alright, we're also going to have a config file, and what that's going to do is it's going to hold our database credentials, and also we're going to set some constants, set some paths, for instance the root path that we can use through the application. Alright, so config.php. Okay, now we're going to want to have, in addition to our MVC structure, we're going to want a classes folder. Alright, and this is basically like a lib folder or libraries. This is where we're going to have our core, our base controller, our base model, our bootstrap file, which is going to take care of redirecting and getting the parameters from the URL, things like that. All right, so let's just create the folders first. Okay, so in addition to classes, we're going to have controllers. We're going to have models, and we're going to have views. And the last folder we're going to need is the assets folder, and that's just going to have the CSS. If we had any JavaScript or anything like that, we could put that in here, any image files. But what I'm going to do is just create a folder in here called CSS, and then create one called JS, even though we're not going to use any JavaScript, but you probably want it just in case. In the CSS folder, I'm going to create style.css. Okay, now we're going to be using Bootstrap, and we'll get that in a little bit. Alright, so I just want to create that for now. And then the next thing I want to do is go to our classes folder, and we want to create a new file, and I'm going to call this bootstrap.php. Okay, so this is going to take care of taking in our request, or whatever the URL, processing the controller, whatever controller, and whatever action we want to call. So let me give you an example of what the URL would look like. Alright, so let's say we have a user's controller, and we have a method in there called register. So we want to be able to go to our URL and then slash users slash register, and then that should call the register action or method or function, whatever you want to call it, that's inside of our users class. All right, that's how we want this to work. And in order to do that, we have to create a .htaccess file, because we need to set it up so that when we do this, it's actually going to go in as a GET request, and we can get these parameters. All right, so let's do that. In our root file here, we're going to need a .htaccess file. Okay, now we can't just create it. If you're in Windows, at least, you can't just create it here, because it has a dot in it. It's just going to take it as an empty file. So what we need to do is, let's open up Notepad. Okay, and you want to run this as an administrator. Okay, and then what we're going to do is say open, and I'm sorry, not open. We want to save. We're going to save as, and then let's go to, let's see, where do I have this? Alright, so I'm using amps, so that means I have my www folder right here, and then PHP dev. Okay, you want to go wherever your project is. And then what we're going to do is change this to all files, and then we're going to save it as .htaccess and save. Alright, and you can see now we have it right there. So what I'm going to do is just paste something in here, and this is what you guys want to have. Alright, so basically we're telling our Apache server that we want the rewrite engine on, and then we're going to create a rewrite rule that we're going to specify. The first parameter is going to be a controller, and the second parameter is going to be an action, and then anything after that is going to be just a parameter in that action. Alright, in this case an ID. Okay, so just get that in there, and then we'll save it, and then we don't have to look at this again. Alright, so we'll close that up. Now we'll open up our bootstrap file. Alright, and I'm just going to add my project to Sublime Text. Alright, so inside the bootstrap file, we're going to create a class called bootstrap. Alright, and we're going to specify a couple properties. This is all stuff that we've went over in this course. So controller, we want to specify an action, and we want to specify a request. Alright, and then we're going to create a constructor. So public function construct. Okay, and we're going to make that take in the request. Okay, then what we want to do is we want to assign this request to that request that comes in. Alright, and then what we want to do is we want to check for the controller. Alright, so we should be able to access that. So we'll say if this request controller, if it's equal to nothing, that means if we look at this URL here, we have the user's controller register action or method. Alright, so if there's no controller, basically if it's the root here, then we want to load the home controller, because that'll be the home page. Alright, so to do that, we'll say this controller is going to equal home. Okay, then we'll put an else, and then else we'll say this controller is going to equal whatever the request controller is. Okay, so whatever's there. I'm sorry, this request. Okay. Now for the action, which is the second piece of the URL here, so users/register. So register would be the action. Alright, so now we have to handle that. So if this request action, if this request action is equal to nothing, that means it's going to be the index action. Alright, so we'll say this action is going to be equal to index. Then we'll do an else. And same thing we did with the controller. We're just going to set the action. Alright, and that's the construct for Bootstrap. So what I want to do is save this, and then we're going to go to our index file, and we have to include a couple things. So first we'll include the config. So we want to say require config.php. Make sure we put our tags in here as well. Alright, and then for now we want to just require the bootstrap file. That's going to be in the classes folder. So classes/bootstrap.php. Alright, and then what we're going to do is create a variable called bootstrap. Set that to new bootstrap. Now remember, if we look at the class, our constructor is going to take in the request. So the request is going to come in the form of the get superglobal. Okay, so we just want to throw that in there. Alright, and then once the constructor runs, what we're going to want to do is call a method called createController, alright, which we haven't done yet. So before we do that, let's just save this and reload. Okay, so we're not going to see anything, but to test out to see if we're actually setting these things, let's go right here and let's do echo. We'll say echo this controller. Okay, and you can see we're getting home because we have no subfolder here. All right, if we say /users, now we can see that the controller is now users. We can do the same with the action. Okay, so if we reload this, it's going to be index because we have no action. If we say /register, we get register. All right, so we're just formatting our request based on the URL. So we can get rid of that. All right, so in the index, what we're going to want to do after that is create a variable called controller, and we want to set that to bootstrap create controller. Alright, so let's save that and go back into our bootstrap class, and we'll create that method. Okay, so once we figure out what controller we want, we're going to make sure that it's a class. Okay, so we want to check for the class. So we can do that with a function called class exists. Alright, so we'll say if class exists, and then we want to pass in this controller. Remember, we have the controller set, so we can access it from down here with this. Okay, so if it exists, then we're going to create a variable called parents and set that to class parents this controller. Alright, and then what we want to do is check to see if it's extended. So check extend, and we'll say if in array, controller, and then parents. And then in here we want to check to see if the controller includes the action that's passed in. Okay, so we'll say if, I know it's a lot of if statements. I'm going to say if the method exists. Okay, just like we have the class exists, we can check for a method. Alright, so we want to put in the controller here, so this controller, and we want to check to see if the action exists. Okay, so right here we're going to say this action. Okay, and then if it does, we're going to return new, and then whatever the controller is. Okay, so this is going to instantiate it. This controller, and then we'll pass in here this action, this request. Okay, because we want to send the request along. Alright, and then right here we're going to put an else. Okay, else, then we're just going to, we need to inform the user that that method doesn't exist. And what we'll do is just echo out in h1, and we'll say method does not exist. Alright. Then what we want to do is do an else for this. And we're just going to say that, oh, actually we have to return right here. Okay. I'm just going to copy that, and then here we're going to specify that the base controller isn't found. Alright. Base controller not found, and then we'll just say that here. Alright, and then finally we want an else for this right here. Not there. What is it, this one? We want the class exists one, which is this. Yeah, okay, so we'll say else and paste that in. Okay, this one, the controller class doesn't exist. So we're just going to say controller class does not exist. Alright, so this is basically just going to instantiate the whatever controller that that's typed in the URL. So let's go ahead and test this out. Okay, we reload this. Controller class does not exist, and this is what we should be getting because we don't have that class. But what I'm going to do is stop here, and then in the next video we're going to create our core or base controller class, which will go in our classes folder as well. Alright, because we need a base controller for all of the other controllers to extend from. Alright, so I will see you in the next video.